Awesome.
Awesome. Right. Well, welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Rachel Barker. I'm CEO of Plastics New Zealand. It's really great to have you guys all here. We've got a good mix of people across the system today, from packaging manufacturers, brand owners, consultants. I think we even saw someone from one of the councils in there. So yeah, really diverse bunch of attendees today. So yeah, please feel free to pop your comments in the chat. Let us know who you are, where you're from, and where you're at with the plastics journey. And also we will be using the Q&A at the end. So if you've got any questions in the meantime, please do put them in the Q&A rather than the chat, just to make it easier for us. So, sweet. Okay. So we've moved a little bit over the last few months in terms of plastics, but you know, good old New Zealand, we always have a fairly long break over Christmas. We all went on holiday. Saying that, we've seen quite a lot of good collaboration happening over the last few months between brands checking in with associations, asking questions of different consultants around the specifics of the New Zealand system, which is really good. Seeing that accelerate means that the design aspect is accelerating with the circularity side of things. And we've seen some really good progress with some of the working groups that Plastics New Zealand is running as well, which is basically pulling together people from across the system, from brand owners and designers to packaging manufacturers and product manufacturers in some cases, waste management companies, the reprocessors, and others from across the system as well. So one of the really exciting things that we've seen is some improvement of the collection of polypropylene across New Zealand. We'd already seen a bit of a change over the last couple of years, but we are now at over 90% access to polypropylene collection at curbside throughout the country, which is really exciting. So yeah, so things like this, forums like this, the LinkedIn group and everything, the more that we can all chat together, collaborate and come together to have these conversations, the faster that journey to circular plastics in New Zealand is going to occur. So really awesome to have you guys with us. Next one, Katie. Sweet. So we continue to hear from you guys that you know, the plastics industry is ready to move, and when I say the plastics industry, that's not just the plastics manufacturers, that's those using plastics as well. You know, so everyone is basically better to move forwards to make better packaging and better products for our systems to make sure that we can achieve circularity. There's many drivers for that change, but primarily it's coming down to government policy, both locally and internationally, a desire to do better as a business and to meet consumer and customer expectations, you know, around buying better, you know, coming back to that, you know, building back better sort of type of concept. We responded to the need with the creation of RePlastics, which is a practical guide that you guys can download, series of training sessions, and then broader conversation around plastics and how we can actually achieve circularity in New Zealand. Basically looking at how we transform our view, our use and our recovery of those materials to keep them going again. So as part of this program, Plastics New Zealand brings together accurate info to the best of our knowledge, best practice local and international advice and guidance, alongside some simple tools that can actually help you, New Zealand's decision makers, to determine your pathway towards a circular plastics economy. We formed this in partnership with Circularity, a circular design and strategy partner who helped us design the RePlastics brand and messaging for our content to accelerate the shift towards a circular plastics economy. I'm really thrilled to have Sam and Katie with us today to talk us through this particular chapter of the RePlastics guide, which is focusing on that, basically the New Zealand landscape and where things are at for us. So hand over to you girls.
Yeah. Kia ora, Rachel, and kia ora koutou. It's wonderful for us to be here. I'm Sam, environmental strategist at Circularity, and I'm joined here today with Katie, who's our engagement analyst. And so both of us here are going to be taking you through our session today. And yeah, we really just have to thank Rachel and the Plastics New Zealand team for continuing to lead this conversation in Aotearoa. Circularity, just a little bit of background on us. We're a circular design and strategy partner and we apply circular principles to the environmental challenges of BAU. So it's our goal to help businesses unlock solutions that are better for people and planet faster than ever before. And so by collaborating with Plastics New Zealand in this way, that really helps us deliver on that core goal and really aligns to our kaupapa as an organisation. And so we're really thrilled to be working with you all to help address the fundamental challenges that we all face with plastics in Aotearoa. So as Rachel highlighted, we just want to give everyone who's come into this, you might not have come to the previous webinar, you might not have heard of the RE Plastics program before. What we're talking about when we talk about RE Plastics is the full program and the conversation that is being led by Plastics New Zealand. So this includes an interactive website with a whole lot of resources you can watch and read and download, and primarily the core asset that we have there is the design guide, and that's what the focus of our session today. Again, like Rachel said, helping you to actively transform how you view, use, recover and reuse plastics responsibly and to their full potential. So the guide has 5 chapters and they're really allowing you to take your understanding, no matter where you sit in the system, about the impacts of our current linear system, looking at understanding in more detail the attributes of plastic, how they're formed and how they are best used based on the types of plastics that we have available, and then into who are the different players in the landscape. And that's the real fundamental focus for us here today. Who are the different players in the system? What is their role and what is their opportunity to collaborate and connect to help reshape plastics in Aotearoa? And then finally, chapters 4 and 5, that's where we start rolling our sleeves up, no matter where we are, looking at how can we put circular strategies to work. How might we eliminate, circulate or innovate with your materials, your products, your packaging, and explore new options to meet those challenges and to maximize opportunities in your system. We'll have our final webinar on chapters 4 and 5, designing for circular plastics and putting your roadmap in place, next Thursday, the 17th of February. So we'll send you a link at the end of this. So if you want to register for that, you're more than welcome to join us. But the focus today really is on that 3rd chapter, who's in the New Zealand plastics landscape, what's their role, and how can we connect and collaborate to reshape plastics. And we know this is important, and the RE Plastics program overall is really important for Aotearoa because the way that we're using plastic is unsustainable. I'm sure many of us here are really aware of this challenge that we have 45,000 tonnes of plastic being used by New Zealand annually, which is making up 12% of the waste found in our landfills. What this means is that plastic is the 3rd largest contributor after organic and timber waste. So you can see that on that diagram here. It's a huge part of the material flows within Aotearoa, so how we use it matters. The National Resource Recovery Task Force estimated that the annual tonnage of recycled plastic in Aotearoa was 45,000 tonnes, of which 90% was exported. So it's a huge loss of a resource that can have value to us out of our system. We're bringing a lot in and then we're sending a lot out. So it's a huge missed opportunity for us in Aotearoa to do better with our material flows.
Yeah, so right now in Aotearoa, we're operating within a linear system. And all of these environmental impacts that Sam mentioned are occurring because of the linear system we have for so many of our materials, including many of our plastic products and packaging, and where we take, make, use, and then waste these resources. But the system is changing. The Ministry for the Environment has introduced significant legislation changes to accelerate the reuse and recovery of plastic materials in New Zealand. Some of these changes include the mandated product stewardship for 6 priority products, which you've probably heard of, including plastic packaging and farm plastics, an expansion of the waste levy, the phasing out of hard to recycle plastics, the Plastics Innovation Fund, a standardization of labels, a container return scheme, and a coming National Plastics Action Plan. Further detail on all of these changes are outlined in Chapter 3 of the Design Guide itself, so you can have a look at that. Yeah, so these changes that are coming are significant. And we heard a lot of you asking questions about what trends we will see in New Zealand's future plastics landscape. So some of these plastic grades will no longer be legal to use in packaging. Curbside collection schemes and labeling will become standardized. You may have to provide total stewardship across your product and packaging's life cycle and plan what happens at the end of its use, at the end of its lifetime. You'll also have to pay at least 3 times more for your landfill by 2025. So that's pretty significant. And as you can see in the table here, the types of plastics that will be able to be collected and reprocessed in New Zealand in the future is changing dramatically. So all of these details are, again, in our Replastics Guide there for you to reference. And they provide for us foundations to create a better future for plastic flows in our economy.
What's really important to take from the increasing green that you saw on that table and the shift in who's able to recover and what materials are going to need recovery systems and circular flows, is that we're able to envision a new future. And that's what Plastics NZ is leading the conversation on. What does this new future look like, where we reshape plastics, create a circular system that focuses on designing out waste, keeping materials in flow and regenerating our natural environment. And what's really powerful about this vision is it's one that we can shape together. So in this circular plastics economy, plastic is just no longer disposable. It's an economically valuable resource, and you can see how that starts to shift with this diagram here. We're looking at ways that this commodity doesn't make its way into our landfills, it doesn't make its way into our waterways anymore, and it doesn't pollute our whenua. And the way we achieve that is by designing our products to be circular from the outset. So we're looking at here ways that we can use materials that can be recycled, composted or reused, and designing to enable that system to actually be in place. For products in particular, that might be using modularity to allow for repair and replacement, and then as well as designing the actual systems that ensure the products are kept in use for as long as possible. So rather than just flowing through the system once, they continue to move through that system over and over again. And then finally, once they get to a point that that cannot happen, they're able to be recovered for repurposing or recycling at that end of that use phase. The opportunity, of course, of all of this, of these huge changes that we're seeing in legislation and the way that consumers are interacting with plastic, is that we can form new ways of doing business. This might be new options for subscribing, leasing, sharing, buying back, returning products. All of these help to reduce overall consumption and help to retain value for all of us in the system. We know that we're at the start of this journey to design this low emission circular plastics economy. And so we've really described what this future might look like and the benefits we'll have to help with your case studies, with your business cases, and that's in chapter 1 and 2 of the guide. And we also cover that in the last webinar. But what we really want to focus on here today is what you'll notice about this diagram and the circular plastics economy is the number of connection points across the system. Unlike the linear flow that Katie showed, there's a number of connection points. And what that means is that there are a number of people and roles and responsibilities within the system that need to be in place so we can have a continual flow from each stage. This system essentially is made up of many players. And so to create a circular plastics economy, what we see, what we've heard from all of you in our research and in the questions that you asked before this webinar is that we need to connect our broken system. Increasingly, many of us understand the need for a circular plastics economy, but reshaping plastics will take all of us. We need to understand the potential and the capabilities of each player in our system and work together to utilize solutions that already exist, because there are many that we don't know about, and create them when they don't. And that's what this chapter is intended to help you to do. Our current system tends to operate in silos or is really inhibited by a disconnection in information. So one of the primary challenges that we heard from you in the questions before this webinar was about how do we access more information on who can help us reshape plastics? And that shows up in lots of questions. It showed up in questions like, who can give me a recycled plastic package? And how can they help? It's a challenge that's faced by everyone. It includes the producers who are trying to utilize and recycle more plastic. And it's also those who are trying to collect it, collect the right types of materials at the end of their life. But it's also felt by brand and product designers who are working really hard to redesign their products for recovery systems that exist in Aotearoa, but then are unable to find a producer to make the product. And so again, the more that we can foster these connections, the more we can start to solve these problems together. So when we look at this next chapter, we're really thinking about the need for successfully creating a circular plastics economy in Aotearoa, requiring all parties to play their part, to shifting us from this disconnected linear system to a connected circular plastics economy that recovers and retains the value of plastic materials in Aotearoa. So what we're going to be looking at with you is who are the connections that, who are the people, what are the kinds of connections that we're looking for, and what is the opportunity for collaboration to create this new plastics economy where we're all coming together to shift that system from a linear one to one where we use, repair, recycle, remake, and reuse our plastics in Aotearoa. And that is the New Zealand Plastics Landscape chapter. What I also just wanted to cover is just quickly the other things that you'll explore in this chapter of the design guide. So we will look at the New Zealand plastics economy. You'll be able to understand a bit more about the flow of plastic materials through Aotearoa, the key changes to New Zealand's legislation. These are all things that we just touched on briefly in this session, but again, you can dive into a little bit deeper, as well as the challenges and benefits that plastic brings to a circular economy, setting the foundation for what you might seek to solve. From here on in, we're going to be focusing on defining those various types of recovery partners and the players in the system and what their role is in a circular plastics economy. And then you'll be able to dive a little bit deeper into seeing types of businesses who are leading the way. So Katie, do you want to take us through the change?
All right, so who is responsible for this change? We all are at our various levels of the system. So when it comes to successfully creating that circular economy, we must all play our part, from suppliers of plastics through to brands and manufacturers, again through to retailers and consumers, then local government and ratepayers, waste operators, reprocessors, and remanufacturers. So we need to increase our ambition and move beyond to drive change from within the system and take responsibility as these players. But before we get started, what role do you play in the system? Would you please comment your role in the chat? And also when people were introducing themselves, we've also got a pretty good overview there. We've got some people from government as well as plastic producers there. We've got a lot of brands and manufacturers. Yeah, awesome. So it looks like we're going to be able to start thinking through, as we go through these different roles, who you might want to connect with after the session. Who do you know a little bit more about through this webinar, and therefore you might have better questions to bring to them, or collaborations that you might be sitting in your mind that you can start to understand a little bit better. So it's awesome to have so many people from across the plastic system, and it really helps us to shift the perspective of who is responsible for the change and how might we make the change here to reshape plastics. All right, so starting with suppliers, how might you shape this change? So as a supplier, you have the opportunity to lead by actively promoting the use of recycled or reprocessed materials to brands and manufacturers, encouraging them to keep plastic materials in flow and reduce the demand for virgin plastics. You're also able to explore technologies that enable recycled plastics to be used with a wider range of products and packaging. You can also be constantly researching, developing, and investing in bio-based feedstocks that will shift away from fossil fuels, as well as advanced technology that helps keep materials at their highest value. And by doing this, you can help reduce the amount of virgin plastics being used. And then as a brand or manufacturer, how might you redesign impact? We see your opportunity as being able to choose packaging formats, materials, adhesives, inks, everything that's used in your packaging and products, and ensuring that it doesn't create environmental harm across the full life cycle, and it's designed to be kept in flow. You also have the opportunity to create or support systems that promote repair, recovery, and reuse of materials and products. And you can connect with retailers to educate and guide end users to make more responsible decisions in the use and end-of-life care of products and packaging to ensure that these materials can be recirculated in practice and in Aotearoa. And by doing this, you can help increase the public knowledge and demand for reuse and recovery, and ultimately keep plastic out of our landfills. Yeah, so a great way to do this is to create a product stewardship scheme, which takes responsibility for a product's life cycle. So this is a model where whoever designs, produces, sells, or uses a product take responsibility for minimizing the product's environmental harm throughout all stages of its life cycle. And as we mentioned, the government is co-designing mandatory product stewardship schemes for 6 priority products that will be really good basis for what a product stewardship scheme looks like in Aotearoa. These are also expected to expand in the coming years. But we also do have quite a lot of product stewardship schemes already operating within Aotearoa. A lot of them are being driven by these brands and businesses themselves. So an interesting example of product stewardship here is the voluntary soft plastics recycling scheme, which is funded by the Packaging Forum, and it has many store participants, including Countdown, The Warehouse, New World, Pack and Save, and it's partnered with 2 North Island plants that reprocess the soft plastics into new products. And there are a number of other examples of product stewardship schemes that you can find in this table in the guide.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks, Katie. And tables like this are really valuable for getting ideas, like Katie said, about how a product stewardship scheme might look, or how you might actually build on an existing scheme and design your product for that. And that leads us into the retailers, and the opportunity there for retailers is to really prioritize the selling of products based on the circularity of that total product and its packaging as well. So whether locally sourced or imported, you can start to look for products that are able to be processed within our local infrastructure, or things that have the ability to support closed loops for material reuse and the demand for recycled content. You can also actively promote these systems, making it easier for consumers to purchase products based on their ability to close the loop. So it's a real driving demand function, driving demand for the right kind of products, supporting those brands, those suppliers, those reprocessors who are actively putting the systems in place, and then helping with that communication to consumers, because we all have a role to play in making it easier for our consumers to know what to do with a particular product or package. And so you might connect with customers by communicating the systems in place to keep materials in flow and at high use. What can they do with it, and how might they do with it? You might promote awareness of local infrastructure's ability to recover the products and packaging. Again, promoting awareness that now number 5 plastic could be recycled in that region. And by doing this, it allows you to start preventing plastics that are unable to be recycled locally from reaching the area in the first place. So preventing that inflow of linear plastics, and also ensuring that consumers are able to support the use of those recovery systems that are in place. Again, removing that requirement for materials to be moved offshore and helping to keep plastics out of our landfills, but also the landfills of our neighbouring countries. Some models that you might start to investigate for this, and we dive a lot deeper into these models alongside product stewardship in chapter 4, are things like reuse, redistribution, and repair. Looking for partners that enable you to create that circular system. And it's really important that we do this because it helps to conserve the value in plastics. So again, rather than downcycling that plastic, how might we retain its value? and reduce that leakage into the environment, reduce the amount of energy and resources that are needed for the manufacture of your material or product. In this chapter, again, we have a table looking at what are some of the reuse, redistribution and repair systems that currently exist in Aotearoa. How might we leverage those? Or you can start thinking about how might you design something similar. An example of this is that reuse scheme that many of you may be familiar with after summer, hopefully, was Goblets Good to Go, which has those reusable cups. They're made out of plastic, but it now means that because that reusable system is in place, 99% of music festivals use these washable and refillable cups for drinks, and they feature that QR code on the bottom for tracking. So again, removing that linear system, reducing a whole lot of landfill and recycling requirements on site for those facilities.
All right, so from retailers to consumers, what opportunity do we all have as consumers? This opportunity is to actively seek information and choose to buy products based on the entire life cycle of the product. And consumers are increasingly playing an active role in returning products for reuse and reprocessing and getting involved in these schemes in the first place. You can connect with retailers and manufacturers to advocate for better plastics designs. And yeah, consumers have an important role in the end-of-life systems to keep plastics out of our landfill and our environment. Next, as ratepayers, how might we shape the future of plastics? Your opportunity as either local government or ratepayers is to choose effective methods and materials to collect and sort plastics, like curbside sorting and community recycling hubs. You can collect onshore or offshore reprocessors, also selected by other councils or waste operators, to really maximise that efficiency and scale, which we all need here. You play an important role in identifying and funding the correct infrastructure to keep plastic circulating ultimately as locally as possible.
Yeah, awesome. And so once those materials have been used in our system and the consumers have utilised that product or that package, this is when we start looking at those recovery systems. And there's some really interesting nuances between the different players from this point on that we want to highlight, and the guide helps to better explain. So at this point, we have our recyclers who collect, sort the plastics. And then we also have the reprocessors who sit alongside them. And so the first thing to understand is that the recyclers are waste operators that collect, sort, wash and bale plastics, getting them ready to be recycled back into the original products or packaging, which is kind of what we call the perfect loop, or an alternative product by reprocessors. Then we have the reprocessors, and these are the players that are taking the plastics collected at curbside through community hubs, through product stewardship schemes, through businesses, and they're doing the actual mechanical recycling of them into new materials, packages, or products. So there is a difference between these two players in the system, and it typically gets confused, and that can just be a language thing. And it's important to understand the different role because often you need both. So those recyclers, to recap, are the ones collecting, sorting, and aggregating the material. They generally don't reprocess the plastic, or not necessarily reprocess that plastic back into noodles or remanufacture it into new products. The people that are doing the melt process into recycled plastic are the reprocessors. And so it's important we get that right. So when you're considering your plastic partners for recovery, you need to identify the recycler, i.e. the person who's going to collect the product, and the reprocessor capable of recycling that into a new material, package or product. If you're looking for a recycling system, you do need both, or you need someone who can play both roles in your system. And so both of these have a really important role to play for reshaping the use of plastics. As a recycler, the opportunity is really to look at ways to operate technologies and collection systems and sorting systems that better support the reuse systems that we have in place and the reprocessors. So again, by connecting into other players in the system to understand how we can increase the use of recycled content or utilize reuse schemes, This is a really critical role, and how can you support with really good systems that segregate those materials, clean them in a way that as many of them as possible can continue to flow through the system. Recyclers can connect and need to connect with basically everyone in the system, like we all do, but particularly local government to find new system opportunities, and with those plastic reprocessors, again, because that's the next step for many of your materials. Again, this is a really important role in limiting the waste entering our environment by ensuring those materials continue to stay at high value because they're clean, they're collected, and they're separated into their right types of plastic. In New Zealand, we've got a number of recyclers, but what you can kind of see from the table in the guide is primarily a lot of the actual infrastructure is based in the North Island, which can present a challenge and an opportunity to increase the capabilities in New Zealand. There are a lot of bigger players, but there are also some small operators near you that you may not know about. So it's definitely worth checking out what their capability is to collect and sort for the package or product that you're working with, or the area that you're in. And what Rachel touched on at the very beginning of this is, by making the information available about who the different players are in the system, we're starting to enact some quite significant change. And a really good example of this is the map that Plastics New Zealand released last year through a lot of collaborations and a lot of conversations to understand who are the different recyclers, who's collecting different types of plastic in New Zealand. So we now have number 1, 2, and increasingly number 5 across our system, and that's a result of being able to share and collaborate the capabilities. And this is really important because number 5 does have a lot of value for a number of reprocessors and a number of remanufacturers. And before this, a lot of that volume was going offshore, and we still continue to import a lot of virgin material to meet the need for manufacturing locally. So making this information accessible, understanding who's capable of doing this in your system, enables us to make those significant changes.
Yeah, so our reprocessors also have a massive opportunity to lessen impact on so many levels. And this is through prioritizing reprocessing materials onshore. You can also develop new wash, decontamination, and processing methods, depending on what plastics are being used near you. You can also connect with recyclers and remanufacturers to identify potential new products or packaging for reprocessing, and also designing products so that they can be reprocessed effectively. So yeah, reprocessors also play a really important role in limiting waste from entering the environment. Yeah, so as you can see in our table here, we have a number of reprocessors in Aotearoa, and they're able to process many different types of plastics. Interestingly, there are over 3 expanded polystyrene reprocessors in New Zealand, but we still face significant limitations in diverting this material from landfill and from our environment. So we see an opportunity there for sure. A key point we want you to take away from this session is that reprocessors can collect both post-consumer and post-commercial plastics, and that presents a really good opportunity for us. So if you're a brand or a supplier, you can talk to a reprocessor about your plastic and how it is collected to see how you could create a circular system for it or create a new product. So for example, we have curbside reprocessors, such as Aotearoa New Zealand's reprocessed PP number 5, which Axiom Plastics uses to make components for method recycling bins, which you can see on the left there. We also have Flight Plastics, which turns post-consumer packaging into rPET sheet to then be made into new packaging. Some of the examples we have of post-commercial reprocessors are Rural Direct, which recycles polyethylene drain and culvert made partly from LDPE film, and the HDPE production waste collected from businesses, which is then reprocessed into those road safety barriers, which we see. So that's pretty exciting. And finally, for remanufacturers, your opportunity is to ultimately close this loop and think creatively about new ways to do it. So remanufacturers can choose to utilize recycled materials, especially back into their original products or packaging in what we call a perfect loop. But you can also create alternative products with a preference for upcycling materials within Aotearoa and retaining that value here. You can also connect with plastic suppliers as well as with reprocessors. And you play an important role in the final stage of closing the loop on plastic packaging and products to ensure that it continues to circulate out of landfill.
Yeah, awesome. And so as we have seen, to achieve the circular plastic economy, it takes all of us. And what's really valuable about walking through the system is that you can see that reprocessors can't invest in the right infrastructure if they don't understand what the brands and the suppliers of plastic are trying to achieve. Likewise, the brands and suppliers of plastic cannot design the right packages and products if they don't understand the capability of our reprocessors and remanufacturers in Aotearoa. So that continual conversation and those co-design of solutions is really valuable to ensure that we're retaining value in the most effective and efficient way. We really want to utilize the full capability of our existing system in Aotearoa and then also invest and spend our time on the areas that are going to add the most value, and understanding the existing system is the first step to doing that. So now that we've taken you through a really brief introduction to the current New Zealand plastics landscape and where you can go to dive a little bit deeper into who you might connect with and the role of each of these players within the guide, we'd love to hear from you. The most powerful thing that we can do is to enable you as decision makers to determine your pathway to a circular plastics economy, and that's what we're trying to do here today. So what we'd love to hear from you, your reflections on what we've talked about this morning, so this afternoon. So what is the player in the system that you feel most disconnected from and need to connect with? We'd love for you to put that in the chat. And then what is the problem that you'd like to solve with them? What problem are you looking to solve with someone else in the system? While we do that, we might start a few of the questions that came through the registration before we move into the more formal Q&A part of our system. So thanks for Rachel for coming back up with us, and I will share some of those questions. So these are the questions that came through the registration, and then we'll go back and look at some of your answers in the chat and what we might do about that. So Rachel, one of the first questions that we had was, where do we get recycled material from, and is there enough supply within New Zealand?
Oh, that's an interesting one. It depends a little bit which sector you're in. If you're in making food packaging out of PET, for example, readily available. If you are making food packaging out of polypropylene, not so much. And that's not just locally, that's globally at the moment. The guide's actually got some really good descriptions about where things are at. I think the girls showed you the transition that we're going through for some of these materials in terms of the basic 1 to 7 categories. So I'd really recommend going and having a look at the tables in the Replastics Guide, because they'll give you an idea of where things are at right now for the New Zealand system and where they're likely to be heading. Globally, we're also in fairly big flux in terms of the quality of the recycled materials. Right now, it's very easy to get recycled plastic, but you might not be able to use it in your food or medical application. As chemical recycling grows, and we're seeing that happening more and more around the world, the waste plastics will be taken right back to that virgin quality level, and we'll be able to go back into any application. So yeah, we're in flux, things are transitioning, so it is a bit of a watch this space, but it's also worth asking the question of your suppliers and those across the system.
Would it be the reprocessors who are sort of starting to invest in that space, or where does that sit in the system, just increasing that recycling to make it in New Zealand?
So definitely the reprocessors are all looking at their capabilities, what they're offering. would have seen expansion in certain areas, and there's more pending. The Plastics Innovation Fund is also likely to have a part to play in that over the next few years. One of the changes I expect to see, for example, if you look at milk bottle at the moment, it's a highly desirable plastic to collect and then use into many other products. It can go back into non-food packaging. You girls showed a couple of the examples where it can go in terms of the culvert pipe, the road barriers, but there's also many other places that it can go. At the moment in New Zealand, it can't be made back into milk bottle. However, capability is going into Australia to make that happen. We've seen that already in UK, Europe, and that is expanding. So at some point in the future, we may well see that occurring in New Zealand because there's a decent amount of it in the market. So that those things are happening, constantly changing, which is also part of the reason we'll try and keep the guide updated as these changes come through. But it is a bit of a transitionary period. If you think about the fact that most of these conversations really started in 2018 when China shut their doors, we're actually only sort of 3 years after that fact, 4 years, get my year right. And it actually takes time to put in these, the research and development into these changes, the actual plants to make it commercial. And yeah, there's a lot of investment coming in from all sides, both the resin manufacturers, the brand owners, governments, everybody is actually involved in these changes.
A great point that you touch on there, Rachel, about the Plastics Innovation Fund and opportunity that presents when we know that we need further investments in some of these things. And another question here was around how has recycled material use been encouraged in New Zealand? Why can't we currently recycle? And again, that's, a huge part of why this guide was formed, and sort of what we'll touch on and what the intention of that last chapter of designing for circular plastics is the way to increase that recycled content, and to support those people who are investing in significant infrastructure is to help create the demand for it, connect with them, demonstrate the scale of what you could shift toward and design something with them so that you both have security of supply and demand essentially for the actual material itself and the reprocessing system. So we have some significant users of plastic on this call from what we've seen. And so if you can help show those reprocessors and those recyclers and those remanufacturers what they could be tapping into, then that really helps build the business case for both of you to design and implement it in the new system. Another question I think that's kind of a little bit to the side of this, Rachel, was around the misleading nature of the recycling logo, and why we don't have a recycling in New Zealand logo. But I think maybe what could we do about that would probably be my build.
Yeah, I've kind of got 2 comments on that one. The first one is that the code on, think about how to say this. The code that is actually on most plastics in terms of the packaging and products is not actually a recycling code. It's a plastic identification code that's to an international standard. The confusion has arisen because of the chasing arrows, basically, and that those have become a recycling symbol by themselves without any of the numbers in them. And then those have been crossing over with the plastics ID code. So the numbers actually are there to help the reprocessors to look at a piece of packaging or a product and say, oh, okay, it's this particular plastic. So it makes their job a little bit easier. Saying that, obviously there's a huge amount of confusion around this across the system. Until we have curbside standardization, it's going to be really hard for a business to actually work out, is their product effectively recyclable or not in New Zealand at the moment. So as we proceed over the next couple of years, as the government actually looks to mandate curbside standardization, I believe the consultation's happening on that this year sometime, then it'll become easier to actually say, well, actually, that particular thing, that 6, your sushi container that's got a 6 on it, which to be honest is going to be phased out anyway this year, that shouldn't have a recycling aspect to its marketing. So, you know, it's a little bit in flux. Part of this is the problem. We are right in the midst of a journey to a better future. So, you know, these things are changing and we've got to keep up with those changes. So the thing to do right now is actually look at, well, actually, where are we? Where are we very likely to be in the near future? And then make sure that your marketing and labelling is based around that, as opposed to what's happening in Europe or the UK, that sort of thing.
That's a great idea, Rachel. And also, I mean, what's in the guide, Plastics New Zealand have included, you know, where this is shifting toward. And so again, like Rachel said, you're able to start preparing for that now, starting to who you need to connect with to be ready, what designs might you need to shift to be ready for when that gets implemented. So you're not sort of left in the lurch when it happens. Just a couple more questions that we want to cover before we wrap up. We had 3 questions on this one. Any predictions and trends that you're seeing of the New Zealand plastics landscape due to COVID and the sustainability demands from consumers? Where could we be thinking we should be heading as we move through the next stage of this turbulent time?
Oh, that's an interesting one. Some of that comes back to curbside standardisation again. So we've got a lot of variance across the system. We've got a lot of developing technology. So in terms of actually, that messaging to the consumer, it's a hard one. Basically, what you've got in New Zealand, if you actually look at who's in the system, you've got a lot of very big brand owners who have great marketing budgets. You have a whole bunch of quite small associations, Plastics New Zealand being one of them, who are membership organisations, and quite frankly, none of us have the money to educate when it comes to consumers. And then we have government who probably won't do any public education until we've got that standardised system. So we're a little bit further away from that. So when it comes to actually the who needs to be educating the consumer, I would actually challenge the brands about their role in this. That actually, if you're putting products on the market and you're looking at that full system, making sure your products can actually be recycled in the New Zealand system or have loops in the international system, that you actually have a role to play in terms of educating the consumer and partnering with councils and government on this sort of thing. We've seen that quite a bit overseas. The USA, for example, has got the recycling partnership, where brand owners have actually come together and they work to not just do the education piece, but also fund some of the infrastructure when it comes to the collection and sorting of their packaging to turn it back into reusable material.
Awesome. I think Humboldt's just built on this a little bit about examples like Tetra Pak, where it confuses consumers because they see that symbol and there's no infrastructure. And I've just responded, Rachel, with what this guide is really intended to do is just, those are perfect examples for chapter 4 of how do we eliminate, circulate or innovate with new systems and solutions to solve that challenge. So we see that there's a problem. The problem is consumer confusion, lack of infrastructure. It's a great example of brands, reprocessors, recyclers being able to come together and look at either new designs or new systems that allow that to be in place. And the government's Plastic Innovation Fund is a sort of a seed that can help you start to make that shift. Just one more question, I think, because we do want to finish on time, and I think it would be great to end on a high before we just touch on what are the next steps from here for you as a brand and as anyone in the recycling system. What materials, Rachel, are you excited about being used more often?
Gosh, that's a really interesting question. I have to say, for me, because I'm looking at all plastics, not just packaging plastics, when it comes down to the discussions that I'm having. Packaging gets a huge focus in New Zealand, but the reality is that this is actually all plastics across all sectors: packaging, medical, automotive, space, you name it, plastics is there. So I think for me, what I'm excited about is not specific plastic materials, it's actually what's happening to create those plastics in the first place. So it's what I'm seeing in terms of renewable feedstocks, in terms of recovered feedstocks. So, whether it's mechanical recycling of, our 1s, 2s, 5s here in New Zealand, or whether it's actually chemical recycling of the really problematic waste streams, and making sure that those can then circulate. So it's that replacement of the fossil feedstocks to the renewable and waste feedstocks, and actually helping to close that loop. There's a huge amount of activity globally happening in that space. And we're even seeing global action in terms of policy that will be encouraging that in the future. There's a voluntary agreement being discussed in Europe at the moment where the resin manufacturers are actually going to, I think it's by 2030, 20% of their feedstocks will be renewable. So, there's commitments being made across the world around this stuff. So I find that quite exciting, probably more than specific materials being used or not used, because the reality is that, even if you look at polyethylene, it's not one material, it's thousands of different types. So it's making sure that anything that we're putting out in that system can actually then recirculate and become circular.
Yeah, awesome. That's a great reflection, Rachel. It's less about the actual material itself, it's about how it's formed, where it comes from, and the impact that it has in its forming, and then where it can go. Awesome. And I think, Sarah, the comments that you're making in the chat there really lead us into this next chapter, which is really about designing for circular plastics and shaping your pathway. And so, as many of you have noted, we all are invested in reshaping plastics. We want this idea, but we know that it's difficult to make these changes. We're looking at full system shifts here. So we need the full system to come together. And so that's why we've got the session next Thursday to dive deeper into how you might start designing for circular plastics and shaping your plastic pathway. This chapter is really looking at how might you eliminate problematic plastics, the parts of your package or material that you don't need, and how might you circulate the materials that you do need, and then how might you innovate to increase the scale and access to those solutions. So again, achieving that systems change. We have 2 really amazing guest speakers with us next week, who are going to share their reflections and their insights on taking their own clients through the journey and designing both new packaging and new products made out of plastic. So this is going to be really insightful for you, no matter where you sit in the system and what type of plastic you're working with and in what form. So we'd love to see you there next Thursday. And what it does is it takes you right to the end of the guide and into the training day. So in the first week of May, the week of the 6th of May, we'll be having a training day, again, working alongside you and using the guide to design your circular plastic solution. This is the best place to come to align the priorities from across your business, uncovering the plastics challenge that you want to solve, and then starting to put that in action. Plastics New Zealand and Circularity are going to be co-running these sessions, and we'd love to see you there and to help you collaborate and connect and actually put it into action. At any time, there's the RE Plastics LinkedIn group, a great place to post your questions. We're starting to post some of the answers to these questions in that LinkedIn group, so we can access more of you with the key questions that you have. And there's also Circular Connect, which is Plastics New Zealand's program to help you start discovering what your opportunities are in designing solutions. And you can get financial support through that process, working with a number of different consultants who can help you on that journey. So again, another great place to go if you've got a problem to solve. If you're interested in this workshop in May, we highly recommend you register your interest. And if you're interested in Circular Connect, that's also on the Plastics NZ website. So a number of places you can go to support. We're really thrilled to be here with you. I want to thank Rachel again for leading this really important conversation. And we hope to see all of you on next Thursday to start designing your plastics pathway.
Thanks, everyone. We'll see you next time.
Kia ora.